The courthouse stood like a forgotten prayer at the edge of Millbrook, its shadows stretching long and crooked across the overgrown lot where dandelions had reclaimed what was once manicured grass. Sarah Chen had driven past it 100 times, maybe more, always with her camera equipment rattling in the back seat of her dusty Subaru, always headed somewhere else. But today, something was different. Today, the October light hit the building's weathered limestone facade in a way that made her foot ease off the accelerator, made her pull over to the gravel shoulder where weeds pushed up through forgotten asphalt. She killed the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, feeling that familiar electric tingle in her fingertips that always preceded a discovery. 3 years of running her YouTube channel, Forgotten Spaces, had taught her to trust that instinct. It was the same feeling she'd had before finding the abandoned sanatorium in Vermont, the same whisper of intuition that led her to the shuttered textile mill in Pennsylvania, where she'd uncovered letters from the 1940s that reunited a family torn apart by war. The courthouse looked back at her with empty windows like blind eyes, its copper dome oxidized to a pale green that spoke of decades, maybe a century, of neglect. The front steps, once grand and imposing, now crumbled at the edges, their concrete cracked and stained with rust from some long-defunct railing. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but time and weather had been unkind to it too. Sections sagged, and near the back corner, Sarah could see where kids, probably, or urban explorers like herself, had peeled it back just enough to slip through. She checked her phone. No signal. Typical. Millbrook was one of those towns that seemed to exist in the spaces between the modern world's attention, tucked into the hills of western Massachusetts where cell towers were sparse and the internet arrived late and reluctantly. Population 2,847, according to the faded sign she'd passed on Route 9. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets fermented in the dark like wine, growing stronger and more intoxicating with age. Before we go inside, if you're enjoying this investigation and want to see where it leads, this story is going to take some time to unfold. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what we find in there. Trust me, you'll want to see this through to the end. Sarah reached for her backpack, mentally inventorying its contents. 2 cameras, extra batteries, flashlight, backup flashlight, first aid kit, water bottle, granola bars, notepad, pens. The essentials. She'd learned the hard way to always be prepared, ever since that incident in the abandoned hospital in Ohio where she'd gotten locked in a basement for 6 hours with a dying phone battery and no food. Her subscribers had loved that video. The raw fear in her voice, the genuine panic, but Sarah had no interest in repeating the experience. The air outside tasted like autumn, crisp and slightly sweet, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and wood smoke from someone's distant chimney. It was just past 3 in the afternoon, which gave her maybe 2.5 hours of good daylight. Plenty of time for an initial exploration. She could always come back tomorrow if she needed more footage. The fence yielded easily to her touch, the gap wider than it had looked from the road. Sarah slipped through, feeling that familiar cocktail of excitement and apprehension flooding her system. This was the moment she lived for, the threshold between the known world and the forgotten one, between now and then. Every abandoned building was a time capsule, a monument to someone's dreams and someone else's failures. They all had stories to tell if you knew how to listen. The front doors were locked, predictably, their brass handles tarnished black with age. Sarah walked the perimeter, her boots crunching through leaves and debris, past windows too high to reach and walls covered in creeping ivy that looked almost deliberately placed, like nature was trying to pull the building back into the earth. Around the back, she found what she was looking for, a service entrance, its door hanging at an angle on one surviving hinge, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She paused, pulling out her phone to start recording. "Hey, hunters," she said, using her community's preferred term for her subscribers. "Sarah here, and I'm about to enter what looks like an abandoned courthouse in Millbrook, Massachusetts. No idea what we're going to find inside, but the building dates back to..." She squinted at a cornerstone barely visible beneath the ivy, 1887 according to this. That's over 130 years of history. Let's see what secrets she's keeping. The interior smelled exactly like Sarah expected: mildew, dust, rot, and something else, something almost sweet and cloying that she couldn't quite identify. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow hallway lined with what must have been administrative offices. Doors hung open like slack jaws, revealing rooms stripped bare of everything except filing cabinets, too heavy or too worthless to steal. Papers littered the floors, water damaged and faded, their words bleeding into illegibility. But it was when Sarah found the main courtroom that everything changed. The double doors groaned as she pushed them open, their sound echoing in the cavernous space beyond. Her flashlight beams swept across the room, and for a moment, Sarah forgot to breathe. The courtroom was magnificent, even in decay. High ceilings with ornate molding, rows of spectator benches still mostly intact, the judge's bench elevated on its platform like an altar. Afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, creating shafts of illuminated dust that looked almost holy. Sarah walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing, and she felt it again, that tingle, that whisper. But stronger now, insistent. She'd learned to pay attention to these feelings, these inexplicable moments of knowing that something important was close. Her subscribers might think it was performance, but Sarah knew better. Some places remembered. Some places wanted to be found. The judge's bench drew her forward. It was massive, carved from what looked like walnut or mahogany, dark wood that had aged to an almost black patina. She ran her hand along its surface, feeling the smooth grain, imagining all the cases heard here, all the lives altered by decisions made from this elevated position. How many people had stood where she stood now, waiting for judgment? How many had hoped for mercy and found none? How many had walked away free or been led away in chains? That's when she noticed it. A seam in the wood that didn't quite align, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Sarah's heart rate kicked up a notch. She pulled out her pocket knife and carefully worked the blade into the gap, applying gentle pressure. Something clicked, and a panel swung inward, revealing a hollow space behind. Inside was a metal box. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pulled it free. It was heavy, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of steel that had rusted at the corners, but remained intact. No lock, just a simple latch that opened with surprising ease. She set it on the judge's bench and aimed her phone's camera at it, making sure she captured this moment. "Okay, hunters," she whispered, her voice tight with anticipation. "Found a hidden compartment in the judge's bench, and there's a box inside. Let's see what we've got." The lid opened with a metallic groan. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly preserved them from moisture, were stacks of documents. Sarah carefully lifted the first bundle, unwrapping it with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a sacred text. The paper was yellowed but readable, covered in elegant cursive handwriting and official stamps. She began to read, and the room seemed to grow colder around her. They were trial transcripts, but not the official kind that would have been filed in the county records. These were personal notes, written in the margins and on separate sheets, documenting something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Case after case, spanning from 1923 to 1956, all involving children. Children taken from their families. Children institutionalized for crimes they couldn't possibly have committed. Children who disappeared into the state system and never merged. And in every case, the same judge's signature at the bottom. Honorable Thomas Whitmore. But that wasn't the worst of it. Clipped to each transcript were photographs, Polaroids and older prints, their emulsion cracking with age. They showed the children, dozens of them, in what looked like an industrial facility. Some were working at machines too large for their small hands. Others stood in rows, their faces blank with exhaustion or fear or resignation. In several photos, adults stood in the background, well-dressed men in suits, observing with satisfaction. Sarah's hands were shaking now, her breath coming faster. She flipped through more documents, finding ledgers that recorded payments, substantial sums of money changing hands, coded but not coded well enough. The pattern was clear, sickeningly clear. Judge Whitmore had been selling children to local factories and farms, using his position to steal them from families he deemed unfit, which, from what Sarah could piece together, meant poor, immigrant, or simply unlucky enough to catch his attention. There were letters, too, correspondence between Whitmore and other men, their names prominent in Millbrook's history. The mayor, the police chief, local businessmen, all of them complicit, all of them profiting. One letter, dated 1947, discussed the problem of a journalist who was asking too many questions and the solution that had been implemented. The casual mention of violence, the easy assumption that their crimes would never be discovered, made Sarah feel physically ill. She sat down hard on the floor, still clutching the documents, trying to process what she'd found. This wasn't just a story about corruption or historical injustice. This was evidence of a systematic, decades-long operation that had destroyed countless lives. These were crimes that had never been solved, victims who had never been acknowledged, families who had spent their entire lives wondering what happened to their children. And the town had to have known, had to have suspected. Yet here these documents were hidden away but not destroyed, as if Whitmore or someone else had kept them as insurance, as leverage, or maybe just as a record of their own power. Sarah's journalistic instincts warred with her horror. She needed to document everything, needed to get this evidence somewhere safe, needed to tell this story. But part of her wanted to put it all back, to seal the compartment and walk away, to pretend she'd never found it. Because once this came out, once she shared this with the world, Millbrook would never be the same. Families who had lived here for generations, who bore these prominent names, would have to confront the sins of their ancestors. And that kind of truth could tear a community apart. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. One bar of signal, just enough for a text message to come through. It was from her producer, Marcus. "How's the shoot going? Find anything good?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then looked at the documents spread around her, at the faces in the photographs looking out from decades past, finally bearing witness. She thought about her YouTube channel, about her responsibility as a documentarian, about the promise she'd made to herself when she started this work, to give voice to the forgotten, to shine light into dark places, to tell the stories that needed telling. She typed back, "Found something big. Really big. I'm going to need help with this." The response came quickly. "How big?" Sarah looked around the courtroom again, at the judge's bench where so many terrible decisions had been made, at the empty spectator seats where a community had gathered to watch justice being performed while injustice was being perpetrated. She thought about all the people who had walked through these doors believing in the system, in the law, in the fundamental fairness of the world, only to have that faith betrayed by the very person meant to uphold it. "Big enough to change everything," she typed. Then, after a pause, "Big enough to destroy a town." She put her phone away and began the careful work of photographing every document, every ledger entry, every horrifying image. The light was starting to fade outside, the shadows in the courtroom growing longer, but Sarah couldn't stop. This was too important. These victims had been silent for too long, their stories buried with them, their families left to grieve without answers or closure. As she worked, she became aware of something else in the room, a presence that defied rational explanation. It felt like being watched, but not with malice. More like witnessing. As if the space itself had been waiting for this moment, holding these secrets until someone with the courage to speak them aloud finally arrived. Sarah had never believed in ghosts, not really. But if they existed, she thought they would be here, in places like this, tethered to the scene of their suffering, unable to rest until the truth was told. She found herself speaking aloud to the empty room, her voice soft but steady. "I see you," she said. "I see what happened to you. And I promise, I'm going to make sure everyone else sees it too. Your stories won't be forgotten anymore." She finished photographing the last document just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the courthouse into near total darkness. Her flashlight batteries were running low, and she needed to get this evidence somewhere secure. But as she carefully repacked the documents into their metal box, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't take them with her, not yet. If these disappeared before she could bring the proper authorities, reporters, historians, lawyers, then the only proof would be her photographs, which could be dismissed as fakes. Instead, she would document the location, secure the building as best she could, and come back tomorrow with reinforcements. This story was too big, too important, to risk losing. Sarah made her way back through the darkened courthouse, her flashlight beam bouncing off walls and creating dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. Outside, the night air felt impossibly clean and fresh after the oppressive atmosphere of the building. She gulped it down, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. As she walked back to her car, Sarah pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to Marcus, who answered on the second ring. Then to a lawyer she'd worked with on a previous investigation. Then to a historian who specialized in New England labor practices. By the time she reached her Subaru, she had 5 people committed to meeting her in Millbrook tomorrow morning. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, looking back at the courthouse. It no longer looked forgotten or abandoned. In the moonlight, it looked like exactly what it was. A monument to injustice, a repository of terrible secrets, and now, finally, a crime scene. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Marcus, are you sure about this? Once you publish, there's no taking it back. She thought about the children in the photographs, about their families, about all the years of silence and suffering. She thought about Judge Whitmore and his accomplices, who had lived their lives in comfort and respect, their crimes never exposed, their victims never avenged. I'm sure, she typed back. This is what we do. We remember the forgotten. As she drove away, Sarah didn't notice the curtain move in one of the windows of the old Victorian house across the street, or the elderly woman watching her leave with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been relief. If she had, the story might have unfolded differently. But she didn't, so it unfolded the way it had to, with the truth, terrible and necessary, about to be unleashed on an unsuspecting town that had built its identity on a foundation of lies. The discovery was made. The reckoning was coming. And Millbrook, Massachusetts, population 2,847, was about to face its past. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She'd checked into the Millbrook Inn, a converted colonial house on Main Street that smelled like lavender and old wood, and spent the hours until dawn sitting cross-legged on the floral bedspread, her laptop open, reviewing the photographs she'd taken. Each image felt heavier than the last, weighted with the accumulated grief of decades. She'd ordered coffee from the proprietor, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a cheerful woman in her 70s who'd seemed delighted to have a guest. "We don't get many visitors anymore," she'd said, pouring cream into Sarah's cup with a generous hand. "Not since the factory closed. What brings you to Millbrook?" Sarah had lied smoothly, practiced at it after 3 years of slipping into small towns and extracting their secrets. "Just passing through," she'd said. "Thought I'd explore a bit." Mrs. Vance had nodded, satisfied, and retreated downstairs, leaving Sarah alone with her conscience and the faces of children who'd been dead longer than she'd been alive. The truth was, Sarah Chen had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she hadn't known it. Especially if she hadn't known it. The pattern of her existence had always been the same, searching, digging, refusing to accept the surface narrative. Her parents had recognized it early, that relentless curiosity that bordered on obsession. "Our little detective," her mother would say, equal parts pride and exasperation, when 8-year-old Sarah spent an entire weekend trying to figure out who had stolen Mrs. Morrison's garden gnomes. She'd eventually discovered it was raccoons, their muddy prints leading right to the culprits, but the satisfaction of solving that tiny mystery had lit something inside her that never went out. But it wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that had roots in her family's own history of silences and unspoken truths. Sarah's grandmother, Papa, had come to America from Hong Kong in 1952, alone, 17 years old, with a single suitcase and a story she refused to tell. She'd built a life in San Francisco's Chinatown, married Sarah's grandfather, raised 3 children, and took her secrets to the grave. Sarah remembered visiting her as a child, remembered the way Popo's eyes would go distant sometimes, staring at nothing, and how she'd flinch when firecrackers went off during New Year celebrations. It was only after Popo died, when Sarah was 15, that her mother had finally shared what little she knew. There had been another family back in Hong Kong. A husband, maybe even a child. Something terrible had happened during the Japanese occupation, during the war, and Popo had fled, had erased that entire chapter of her life so completely that even her own children knew only fragments and whispers. Sarah's mother had cried while telling the story, mourning not just her mother, but the grandmother she'd never gotten to know, the woman whose full truth had been lost to shame or fear or the simple, crushing weight of survival. That loss, that erasure, had haunted Sarah through high school and college. She majored in journalism at NYU, specializing in investigative work, driven by a need to excavate the stories that people tried to bury. Her professors had recognized her talent immediately. She had the instincts for it, the patience, the willingness to chase leads that went nowhere 99 times out of 100. But more than that, she had empathy. She understood why people hid things, why they lied, why they built walls around their traumas. And that understanding made her better at getting them to lower those walls, to trust her with their truths. After graduation, she'd worked for a small investigative news outlet in Brooklyn, covering local corruption, housing fraud, and environmental violations. Good work, important work, but constrained by budgets and editorial direction, and the slow grinding machinery of traditional journalism. She'd watched stories die on editors' desks, watched important investigations get killed because they made advertisers uncomfortable or threatened the wrong people. The frustration had built like pressure in a sealed container, and when she'd finally quit, dramatically, burning bridges with an email she'd regretted almost immediately, she'd felt both terrified and liberated. YouTube had been Marcus's idea. He'd been her college roommate's boyfriend, now a freelance video producer with expensive equipment and cheap rent in Bushwick. "You're good at finding stories nobody else is telling," he'd said over drinks at their favorite dive bar. "Why not tell them yourself? Cut out the middleman." They'd started small, exploring abandoned buildings in New York City, documenting their decay and researching their histories. The channel had grown slowly at first, then explosively when Sarah's video about an abandoned tuberculosis hospital in the Catskills went viral. She'd found patient records that revealed a decades-long medical scandal, and the combination of spooky atmosphere and genuine journalism had struck a chord with viewers hungry for substance beneath the surface. That had been 3 years ago. Now, Forgotten Spaces had 2 million subscribers, enough sponsor revenue that Sarah could do this full-time, could spend her days chasing mysteries in abandoned places while her audience cheered her on. She'd uncovered corruption, solved cold cases, reunited families, exposed environmental crimes. Each video was another piece of evidence that the past mattered, that the forgotten deserved to be remembered, that truth was worth pursuing even when it was difficult or dangerous or demanded more than most people were willing to give. But this, what she'd found in the courthouse, this was different. This was bigger than anything she'd tackled before. And sitting in that floral print room at the Millbrook Inn, reviewing those photographs for the dozenth time, Sarah felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Because here's what nobody told you about being an investigative journalist, about being the person who dug up buried truths. It was lonely. Not the romantic, noble kind of loneliness, but the grinding, isolating kind that came from constantly seeing the worst of human nature, from knowing things you wished you didn't know, from carrying other people's tragedies around inside you like stones. Sarah had spent 3 years accumulating those stones, and some days she felt like she might sink under their weight. She tried therapy for a while, after the incident at the psychiatric hospital in Connecticut, where she'd found evidence of patient abuse that led to criminal charges against 3 staff members. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Reeves, had asked her why she kept doing this work when it clearly took such a toll. Sarah had struggled to articulate an answer. "Because somebody has to," she'd finally said, knowing even as she said it how inadequate that sounded. "Because these stories matter. Because if I don't tell them, who will?" Dr. Reeves nodded, making notes in her leather-bound journal. "And what about your story, Sarah? Who's telling that one?" The question had bothered Sarah for weeks afterward. She'd eventually stopped going to therapy, telling herself it was a budget issue, knowing deep down it was because Dr. Reeves had gotten too close to something Sarah didn't want to examine. Her own story. Her own buried truths. The way she'd thrown herself into other people's mysteries as a way of avoiding her own. The fact that at 32 years old, she lived alone in a studio apartment in Queens, had no romantic relationship longer than 6 months, and could count her close friends on one hand with fingers left over. Marcus knew some of it. He'd been there through the breakup with Jason, the architect who'd wanted her to be less obsessed with her work, who'd accused her of caring more about dead people than living ones. He'd been there when Sarah's father had his heart attack, when she'd flown home to San Francisco and spent a week in the hospital, holding her mother's hand while machines beeped and doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about arterial blockages and surgical options. Her father had survived, thank God, but something had shifted in Sarah during those days. She'd looked at her parents, really looked at them, and seen how old they'd gotten, how fragile. She'd realized that she'd been so busy documenting other people's losses that she'd failed to notice time passing in her own life. And still, she kept doing the work, kept seeking out forgotten places and buried secrets, kept carrying those stones. Now, at 4 a.m. in a strange town, staring at photographs of children whose suffering had been erased from history, Sarah felt something crack open inside her. She closed her laptop and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, Main Street was empty and dark, street lamps casting pools of amber light onto cracked sidewalks. This could have been any small town in America, the kind of place people drove through without stopping, the kind of place that appeared in movies as a symbol of simpler times, of community and tradition and wholesome values. But Sarah knew better now. She knew what could hide beneath that surface. What probably did hide, in countless towns just like this one, in the spaces between official records and collective memory. The disappeared, the abused, the exploited, the erased. All the people whose stories didn't fit the neat narrative communities told themselves about who they were and what they stood for. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Saw you posted on Instagram from Massachusetts. When are you coming home? Your father wants to see you. Guilt twisted in Sarah's stomach. She'd been planning to visit next month, for her father's birthday, but that was before this. Before the courthouse and the documents and the weight of responsibility that now sat on her shoulders like a physical thing. She typed back, soon. Tell Dad I love him. The response came immediately because of course her mother was awake at 4 a.m. California time, which meant 7 a.m. there, which meant she was probably already making breakfast, probably already worrying. He knows. But come home anyway. We miss you. Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. She missed them too, missed the uncomplicated love of family, missed feeling like she belonged somewhere, to someone. But she couldn't go home, not yet. Not with this story unfinished, not with these children's faces haunting her thoughts, not with the weight of justice undone pulling her forward like gravity. She sent back a heart emoji, inadequate but sincere, and put her phone face down on the windowsill. But it was more than addiction. It was also penance. Because Sarah carried her own secret, her own buried truth that she'd never told anyone, not even Marcus, not even Dr. Reeves. When she was 16, her best friend Claire had confided in her about abuse happening at home, about Claire's stepfather and the things he did when Claire's mother worked night shifts. Sarah had promised to tell someone, had promised to help, but she'd been scared. Scared of getting it wrong, scared of making things worse, scared of the consequences. So she hesitated. She'd waited. And 3 days later, Claire had swallowed a bottle of pills and never woken up. The official story was that Claire had struggled with depression, that it was a tragic but unpredictable suicide. Sarah had been the only person who knew different, who knew that Claire hadn't been depressed. She'd been desperate, trapped, crying out for help that never came. And Sarah had lived with that knowledge for 16 years, had let it shape every decision she'd made since. Every investigation she pursued, every story she told, every forgotten voice she amplified, all of it was Sarah trying to atone for the one voice she'd failed to hear when it mattered most. She'd promised herself, standing at Claire's grave, that she would never again let fear or doubt stop her from speaking truth. That she would be brave in ways she hadn't been able to be at 16. That she would make her life mean something by ensuring that what happened to Claire never happened to anyone else if she could possibly prevent it. It was a promise that had led her here, to this room, to this town, to this story. And no matter what it cost her personally, and Sarah had no illusions that the cost would be high, she would see it through. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, darkness giving way to the gray pre-dawn that felt less like morning than like night losing its conviction. Sarah made coffee in the room's tiny pot, burning her tongue on the first sip, welcoming the sharp pain that brought her back into her body. She needed to be sharp today. Marcus and the others would arrive by 10, and then they'd return to the courthouse together, document everything properly, and begin the process of bringing this story into the light. But first, she needed to understand the town itself. Needed to walk its streets, talk to its people, get a sense of the place before she turned its history inside out. Because that was another thing Sarah had learned: context mattered. Communities were ecosystems, delicate and complex, and dropping truth into them like a bomb could have consequences she couldn't fully predict. She needed to be careful, needed to be thorough, needed to honor not just the victims but the present-day residents who would have to live with the revelation of what their town had been built on. She showered quickly, dressed in jeans and a plain black sweater, and headed downstairs just as Mrs. Vance was setting out breakfast in the small dining room. The inn apparently had two other guests, a traveling salesman passing through, and an older man who Mrs. Vance introduced as Mr. Hendricks, a retired teacher who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life. "Sarah's just exploring the area," Mrs. Vance explained, pouring coffee all around. "I was telling her she should visit the Historical Society. We have quite a rich history here." Mr. Hendricks looked up from his newspaper, studying Sarah over his reading glasses. He was maybe 75, with that particular kind of worn dignity that came from a lifetime of public service. "What brings someone from? Where is it, dear?" "New York," Sarah said, keeping her voice light, friendly. "I'm a documentarian. I explore abandoned buildings, research their histories." Something flickered across Mr. Hendricks' face, there and gone so quickly Sarah almost missed it. "The old courthouse," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I noticed it yesterday. Beautiful building. Do you know its history?" Mr. Hendricks took a long sip of his coffee, and Sarah had the distinct impression he was deciding something, weighing options in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "It was closed in 1958. New courthouse built over on County Road. That old building, it just sat there. Nobody wanted to tear it down, historical landmarks and all, but nobody wanted to pay to maintain it either. So it's been slowly dying for the better part of 70 years. "Why was it closed?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious now. Usually courthouses remain in use until they're literally falling apart. "There was a scandal," Mrs. Vance interjected, settling into her chair with her own coffee. "Before my time, mind you, but people talked about it when I was young. Something to do with the judge. I don't remember the details." "Judge Whitmore," Mr. Hendricks said quietly. "Thomas Whitmore. He served for 33 years. They named an elementary school after him, back in the day. It's a community center now." Sarah's heart was hammering, but she forced herself to take a bite of toast, to appear only casually interested. "What happened?" Mr. Hendricks folded his newspaper carefully, precisely, and Sarah recognized the gesture of a man buying time to construct his words.
"He died. Suddenly."
"Heart attack," they said. "And after he died, there were irregularities discovered. Financial mostly. Some cases that didn't sit right. Nothing was ever proven, understood, but there was talk. Enough talk that the county decided a fresh start was needed. New courthouse, new judges, new everything." "What kind of irregularities?" Sarah pressed, keeping her tone light, journalistic but not aggressive. "I was just a boy then," Mr. Hendricks said, and something in his voice made Sarah look at him more closely. His hands were trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly, around his coffee cup. "But I remember my father talking about it. He was a police officer, see. And he said there were things that didn't add up. Cases involving children, families torn apart. My father, he tried to look into it, tried to ask questions. But he was told to leave it alone. Told that some things were better left buried. The room had gone very quiet. Mrs. Vance was staring at Mr. Hendricks with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or fear. The traveling salesman had stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Did he? Sarah asked softly. Leave it alone? Mr. Hendricks met her eyes then, and Sarah saw in them a lifetime of regret, of complicity, of knowing and not speaking. He did what he was told. We all did. That's how it worked back then. You didn't question authority. You didn't make waves. You kept your head down and your mouth shut, and you told yourself that the people in charge must know what they're doing. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But he never forgave himself. And neither have I, for not asking him the questions I should have asked before he died. Sarah felt something shift in the room, in the conversation, in her understanding of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just buried history. This was living history, carried in the bodies and memories of people who'd been children when these crimes were committed, who'd grown up in the shadow of secrets they didn't fully understand but could feel nonetheless, like radiation you couldn't see, but that poisoned everything it touched. Mr. Hendricks, she said carefully, if someone found evidence of those irregularities now, evidence that proved crimes were committed, what do you think should happen? He studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the eerie sensation of being seen, truly seen, in a way that made her want to squirm. I think, he said finally, that truth eventually finds its way through. And when it does, it carries everything with it. He stood, folding his napkin with the same precise care he'd given his newspaper. I hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Chen. And I hope you're prepared for what comes after. He left the dining room, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the old wooden stairs. Mrs. Vance stared after him, then turned to Sarah. I've known Thomas Hendricks for 40 years, she said. I've never heard him speak about that before. Never. And still, there was no question about what Sarah would do. The children in those photographs deserved justice. Their families deserved answers. The truth deserved to be told, regardless of the consequences. She finished her breakfast in silence, thanked Mrs. Vance, and stepped out into the morning. Millbrook was waking up around her, shops opening, people heading to work, the ordinary rhythms of a small town on an ordinary Tuesday. But Sarah saw it differently now. Saw the shadows beneath the surface, the cracks in the facade, the weight of secrets that everyone carried even if they didn't consciously know what those secrets were. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. On the road. ETA 9:45. Ready for this? Sarah looked back at the courthouse, visible in the distance, its green dome catching the morning light. She thought about Claire, about Papa, about all the stories that had been silenced by fear or shame or the simple passage of time. She thought about the 16-year-old girl she'd been, too scared to speak, and the woman she'd become, who'd promised herself she'd never be that scared again. Ready, she typed back. And she was. Marcus arrived at 9:42, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, which was typical for him. Sarah watched his rental van pull into the inn's small parking lot, followed by 2 other vehicles. The cavalry, she thought, feeling relief wash over her. She'd been alone with this secret for less than 24 hours, but it had felt like carrying an ocean on her back. Marcus emerged first, all 6'3" of him unfolding from the driver's seat like a piece of origami coming undone. He wore his usual uniform, dark jeans, vintage band t-shirt. Today it was the Clash, and a canvas jacket covered in pockets for equipment. His camera bag was already slung over his shoulder before his feet hit the pavement. Behind him came the others. Dr. Patricia Monroe, the historian from Boston University who specialized in New England labor practices and who'd helped Sarah with the textile mill investigation. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with gray hair cut in a severe bob and the kind of presence that made even tenured professors straighten their spines. From the second car emerged David Nguyen, a civil rights lawyer who'd worked with Sarah on exposing housing discrimination in Providence, and his assistant, A young paralegal named Keisha Williams who looked like she was barely out of law school but had a mind that could parse legal documents faster than anyone Sarah had ever met. The third car held the biggest surprise. When the door opened, Sarah's mouth actually fell open. "Aunt Linda?" Linda Chen stepped out, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed professional composure crack like ice. Her mother's sister, the family rebel who'd become an investigative reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who'd won a Pulitzer for exposing corruption in the city's housing authority, who Sarah had idolized growing up but hadn't seen in person in over 2 years. "Your mother called me," Linda said by way of greeting, pulling Sarah into a fierce hug that smelled like coffee and expensive perfume. "Told me you'd found something big and were handling it alone. What did I teach you about going into dangerous situations without backup?" Sarah pulled back, torn between annoyance and gratitude. "I wasn't planning to handle it alone. That's why Marcus and the team are here." "Your mother worries," Linda said, softer now. "And after what you told me on the phone last night." "You called her?" Marcus interrupted, looking at Sarah with raised eyebrows. "You said you were keeping this quiet until we had everything documented." "I called my aunt," Sarah said defensively, "who is also a journalist, who has decades more experience than any of us with this kind of investigation." She turned to Linda. "But I didn't expect you to actually fly out here." "I took the red eye." Linda's expression shifted to something more serious, the warmth replaced by the sharp focus Sarah recognized from watching her aunt work. "And I'm glad I did. Because, Sarah, if what you described to me is accurate, you're not just dealing with historical crimes. You're dealing with a conspiracy that probably extends into the present day. The kind of thing that gets people hurt." Dr. Monroe had joined them now, along with David and Keisha, forming a small circle in the parking lot. "Perhaps we should take this inside," she suggested, glancing around at the quiet street where curtains twitched in windows and faces appeared briefly before disappearing. They reconvened in Sarah's room at the inn, 6 people crowded into a space meant for one, the air thick with tension and the smell of Marcus's energy drinks. Sarah pulled out her laptop and connected it to the small TV, displaying the photographs she'd taken in the courthouse. The room fell silent as image after image appeared on the screen. The documents, the ledgers, the photographs of children, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and exhaustion and resignation. "Jesus Christ," David whispered. Keisha had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Dr. Monroe leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, studying each image with the clinical detachment of a scholar, but Sarah could see the muscle jumping in her jaw, the tension in her shoulders. Linda was the first to speak. "How many victims are we talking about?" "From what I could count in the documents," Sarah said, "at least 73 children between 1923 and 1956. But those are just the ones in the records I found. There could be more." "And you're certain these documents are authentic?" Dr. Monroe asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The paper is consistent with the period. The handwriting matches samples of Judge Whitmore's signature from public records I found online, and the photographs," Sarah's voice caught. She cleared her throat. "The photographs are Polaroids and prints that date to the correct era. I'm not a forensic expert, but yes, I believe they're authentic." Marcus had been quiet, which meant he was processing, running scenarios in his mind. "We need to document the location," he said finally. "Get everything on video. Show exactly where you found these materials. Establish chain of custody. If this goes to trial, it'll be in civil court," David interrupted. "Everyone directly responsible is long dead. But their estates, the institutions they represented, the town itself, there could be grounds for compensation to victims' families, assuming we can identify them." "We're getting ahead of ourselves," Linda said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd navigated these waters before. "First priority is preservation and documentation. Second is verification. We need to cross-reference these names with official records, census data, missing persons reports if they exist. Third is identifying living relatives who have standing to pursue legal action or at least deserve to know what happened to their family members. And fourth," Dr. Monroe added grimly, "is preparing for the backlash. Because, Sarah, I need you to understand something. When you release this story, you're not just exposing historical crimes. You're attacking the foundational mythology of this town. Every prominent family, every institution, every source of civic pride, they're all going to be implicated. And people will fight to protect that. Facts be damned. Sarah had known this, intellectually, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I know, she said, but we can't let that stop us. These victims deserve justice, even if it's just the justice of being remembered, of having their stories told. Noble sentiment, Linda said, not unkindly. But nobility doesn't stop bullets. Or lawsuits. Or harassment campaigns. I've seen it happen, Sarah. I've lived through it. When you expose powerful people, even dead ones, their descendants tend to have money and connections and a vested interest in shutting you up. The room fell silent again, everyone processing the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Then Keisha spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. My grandmother was in the Domestic Workers Union here in New England back in the 50s. She used to tell me stories about children who disappeared from Black and immigrant families. Nobody ever investigated. Nobody ever cared. If there's even a chance these documents could give some of those families closure, isn't that worth the risk? Sarah felt a surge of affection for this young woman she barely knew. That's exactly why we have to do this, she said. Not despite the risks, but because the risks are proof that something worth protecting is at stake. Marcus stood, slinging his camera bag more securely over his shoulder. Then let's get to work. The clock's ticking. They convoyed to the courthouse, 3 vehicles moving slowly down Main Street, past the diner where the breakfast crowd was finishing their eggs and bacon, past the hardware store just opening its doors, past the library and the post office and all the ordinary infrastructure of small-town life. Sarah wondered how many of these people knew, on some level, what their town had been built on. How many carried inherited guilt or inherited trauma, passed down through generations like DNA, felt but never fully understood. The courthouse looked different with other people present. Less haunting, more concrete. Marcus immediately began setting up his equipment, multiple cameras with different angles, professional lighting to compensate for the dim interior. Dr. Monroe pulled out a portable scanner and began the painstaking process of digitizing every document, creating backups of backups. David and Keisha started cross-referencing names from the ledgers with Sarah's phone providing a weak, but workable internet connection. Linda stuck close to Sarah, and for the first time that morning, Sarah felt the full weight of having family present. Your mother made me promise to keep you safe, Linda said quietly as they watched the others work. But I know you well enough to know that safe isn't really your priority right now. It's not about what I want, Sarah said. It's about what's right. I know. You're like me that way. Like your papa too, actually. Linda's expression softened. Did your mother ever tell you what papa did during the war? The real story. Sarah shook her head, suddenly intensely curious. She was part of the resistance, against the Japanese occupation. She wasn't just some civilian who fled. She was active, Sarah. She carried messages, helped Allied pilots escape, and gathered intelligence. And when things fell apart, when too many people had been captured and executed, she had to run or die. The families she left behind, husband, daughter, were killed in retaliation for her actions. Linda's voice was steady, but her eyes held decades of inherited pain. She never told anyone because she blamed herself, carried that guilt until it consumed her. And I think she'd be proud of you now for having the courage to speak truths she couldn't. Sarah's throat tightened. How do you know all this? I'm an investigative journalist, sweetheart. After she died, I did what we do. I dug. Found records, tracked down survivors, pieced together the story she took to her grave. Linda squeezed Sarah's shoulder. We all have our ghosts. The question is whether we let them haunt us or whether we give them voice. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Monroe called out from where she was examining the documents. Sarah, you need to see this. They gathered around the judge's bench, where Dr. Monroe had spread out several pages of correspondence. Her face was pale, her usual composed demeanor cracking. "These letters," she said, "they're not just about child labor. Look at this." She pointed to a letter dated 1942. "This is discussing selling children to medical facilities for experimental purposes. Psychiatric institutions, tuberculosis sanitariums, places where they could be used as test subjects for experimental treatments." The room went utterly still. Marcus stopped adjusting his camera. David's hands froze over his phone. Even Linda, who'd seen terrible things in her decades as a journalist, looked shaken. "That can't be right," Keisha whispered. That would be. It would be in violation of every medical ethics standard, every human rights convention," Dr. Monroe said. "Which is precisely why it was done in secret. And why were these records hidden?" She pulled out another document, this one a receipt. Payment of $300 for subject delivery to Braxton State Hospital, dated March 1944. Subject age, 7 years old. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. She thought she understood the scope of what Judge Whitmore had done, but this was exponentially worse. Not just exploitation but torture, not just crime but atrocity. "We need to find out what happened at these facilities," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to know who these children were, what was done to them, if any survived." "Some of these institutions still exist," David said, already typing on his phone. "Braxton State Hospital closed in 1987, but there should be records. I can file FOIA requests, but that'll take weeks, maybe months." "We don't have months," Marcus said. "If Sarah's right about people in this town being connected to what happened, and if they realize we're here investigating, they're going to move to protect themselves. We need to work fast." As if summoned by his words, they heard a sound from elsewhere in the building. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through the corridor toward the courtroom. Everyone froze, exchanging glances. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Had someone followed them? Were they being watched? The footsteps stopped just outside the courtroom doors. Then a voice, male, authoritative. "I know you're in there. I'm coming in." The doors swung open, and a man entered. He was maybe 60, well-dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, with silver hair and the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of money and confidence. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes moving from person to person before settling on Sarah. "You're the documentarian," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor Vance called me. Said you'd been asking about the courthouse, about Judge Whitmore." He stepped further into the room, and Sarah noticed Marcus's hand moving subtly to his camera, ready to record if needed. "I'm Richard Caldwell, mayor of Millbrook, and I think we need to have a conversation." Sarah's mind raced. Play it cool or confront directly. Pretend ignorance or lay their cards on the table. Before she could decide, Linda stepped forward, her journalist instincts taking over. "Mayor Caldwell, I'm Linda Chen, San Francisco Chronicle. We're conducting research into the historical operations of this courthouse. Is there something we can help you with?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the Chronicle. "You're a long way from San Francisco. And research seems like an interesting word for breaking and entering." "The building is abandoned," David interjected smoothly. "And we've been careful to preserve everything we've found. In fact, if you're the mayor, you might be interested in seeing what we've discovered." It was a gamble, and Sarah saw Linda's slight headshake, a warning not to reveal too much too soon. But David was playing a different game, and Sarah realized he was probably right. They needed to know what the town's current leadership knew, what they might do to suppress the story. Caldwell looked at the documents spread across the judge's bench, at the metal box, at the cameras and equipment. "I'm listening." Sarah made a decision. She pulled up one of the photographs on her laptop, one of the less disturbing images, showing a group of children standing in front of a factory. "Judge Whitmore was trafficking children," she said bluntly. "Using his position to declare families unfit, placing children in his custody, then selling them to local businesses as unpaid labor. We've found evidence spanning from 1923 to at least 1956. Caldwell stared at the image, his face unreadable. The silence stretched out, broken only by the distant sound of wind rattling loose window frames. Finally, he spoke. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Dr. Monroe said. It's a documented fact. We have ledgers, correspondence, photographs. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence of crimes committed 70 years ago by people who are all dead. Caldwell looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes. What exactly do you plan to do with this information? Tell the truth, Sarah said simply. Document what happened. Try to identify the victims and notify their families. Help bring some measure of justice, even if it's only the justice of acknowledgement. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through several emotions Sarah couldn't quite read. Then he sighed, and suddenly he looked much older, much wearier. You should have left it buried. Excuse me? Linda's voice was sharp with indignation. I'm not saying what happened was wrong, Caldwell said quickly. I'm saying that digging it up now won't help anyone.
The victims are dead. The perpetrators are dead.
But the town is still here, still trying to survive. We've lost our factory. We've lost our young people to cities with better opportunities. We're hanging on by our fingernails, and the one thing we have left is our history, our identity as a good place, a decent place. You release the story, and you destroy that. You destroy us. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, Keisha said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger, you don't get to prioritize the town's reputation over the truth. Those children deserved better then, and their families deserve better now. Do they? Caldwell shot back. Do they really? What good does it do anyone to learn that their great-grandmother or great-grandfather disappeared into this horror? How does that knowledge improve their lives? How does it honor the dead? He turned back to Sarah. I'm not trying to be callous. I understand your impulse to expose this. But I'm asking you to consider the consequences. Real consequences for real people living right now. Sarah felt the force of his argument, felt it pressing against her certainty, like water against a dam. Because he wasn't entirely wrong, was he? Truth could be destructive. Truth could hurt. She thought about Mr. Hendricks, about the regret in his eyes, about how knowing the truth about his father's complicity had weighed on him for decades. Did she have the right to inflict that on an entire community? But then she thought about Claire, about Papa, about all the stories that had been silenced because someone decided that silence was easier, safer, less disruptive than truth. And she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that Caldwell was wrong. That truth was always worth telling, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The victims had names, she said quietly. They had families who loved them, who spent years searching for them, who died without ever knowing what happened. They deserve to have their stories told. And yes, it's going to be painful. Yes, it's going to force people to confront uncomfortable truths about their town's history. But that's not a reason to stay silent. That's exactly why we need to speak. Caldwell studied her for a long moment, and Sarah saw the exact moment he gave up trying to convince her. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded, more to himself than to her. I suppose I always knew this day would come. My grandfather used to say that Millbrook was built on a rotten foundation, that sooner or later it would all come crashing down. I'd hoped I'd be long gone before it happened. Your grandfather? Dr. Monroe asked sharply. Caldwell's laugh was bitter. John Caldwell. He was police chief during Whitmore's reign. Facilitated the whole operation from what I understand. He died of cirrhosis when I was 12, drunk and alone in a VA hospital, mumbling about the children. My father never spoke about him, never explained what he meant. I only pieced it together later, from fragments and rumors and the things people wouldn't say. He looked around the courtroom with something like hatred. I've spent my entire adult life trying to make this town into something good, something worth preserving. And now you're going to tell the world that it was built on child trafficking and exploitation. If you're still with me on this investigation, we're about halfway through this story, and it's about to get even more intense. Take a second to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates deep investigative content. Your support helps me continue uncovering stories like this. We're going to tell the world what happened, Linda corrected. What you and current residents choose to do with that information is up to you. You can let it define you, or you can let it refine you. You can be the generation that faces the truth and does better. Easy words for someone who doesn't live here, Caldwell said. But there was resignation in his voice now, acceptance of the inevitable. What do you want from me? Access to town records, David said immediately. Property deeds, tax records, anything that might help us identify the businesses and individuals who participated in this system. And protection, Marcus added. If what you're saying is true, if there are people who don't want this exposed, we need to know that the local authorities will ensure our safety. Caldwell looked at Marcus for a long moment. I can't protect you from history, but I can make sure nothing happens to you while you're here. I'll assign an officer to keep an eye on this building, make sure nobody interferes with your work. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you find the victims' families. I hope you give them closure. And I hope that when you tell the story, you remember that most of us living here now are just trying to live good lives. We didn't commit these crimes. We shouldn't have to pay for them. He left, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than his presence had been. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out slowly. Well, she said, that could have gone worse. Could it? Linda asked skeptically. He's going to warn people, Sarah. He's going to give them time to prepare their defense, hire lawyers, maybe even destroy evidence we haven't found yet. Maybe, Sarah conceded. But we have what we have, and it's enough. Plus, now he's on record knowing about this. If anything happens to us or these documents, he's going to be the first suspect. She's right, David said. And his offer of police protection. We should take him up on that. I don't trust him, but having official oversight might discourage anyone else from trying to interfere. They worked through the afternoon, pausing only for sandwiches Marcus ran out to get from the diner. The work was methodical, meticulous, and emotionally exhausting. Every document revealed new horrors, new victims, new layers of conspiracy. Dr. Monroe identified several of the facilities mentioned in the records as having been sites of documented medical abuse, places where patients were subjected to experimental treatments, where the vulnerable were treated as disposable. Keisha cross-referenced names with census records and found families that still lived in the area, descendants who had no idea what had happened to their relatives. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courtroom windows, Sarah found herself standing alone at the judge's bench, looking at the hidden compartment where she'd found the box. She thought about Judge Whitmore, about what kind of man could sit in this seat day after day, wearing robes that symbolize justice, and perpetrate such terrible crimes. Had he felt guilty? Had he justified it to himself somehow, convinced himself he was doing good by putting wayward children to work? Or had he simply not cared, seen them as less than human, undeserving of the protections afforded to children from good families? You okay? Marcus had appeared beside her, his camera finally set down, his usual energy dimmed by the weight of what they'd been documenting. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I keep thinking about how many people had to know. The police, the factory owners, the social workers who processed the paperwork. This wasn't one man's crime. It was systemic. It was a community decision, even if nobody ever said it out loud. That's what makes it so hard to prosecute, Marcus said. When everyone is complicit, no one person bears full responsibility. The guilt gets diffused until it's almost invisible.
He paused.
But you know what? That's also why this work matters. Because you're making it visible again. You're forcing people to see what they've been refusing to look at. Sarah leaned against him, grateful for his steady presence. Thank you for being here. For always being here. Where else would I be?
Marcus said simply.
This is important. You're important. And someone needs to make sure you eat and sleep occasionally. They were interrupted by an exclamation from Dr. Monroe. Sarah, Marcus, you need to see this right now. They hurried over to where she stood with Linda and David, a document in her hands, her expression a mix of excitement and horror. I found a roster, she said. A complete list of all 73 children placed through Whitmore's system, with their names, ages, dates of placement, and most importantly, facility assignments. That's incredible, Sarah breathed, reaching for the document. There's more, Dr. Monroe continued. At the bottom, there's a notation. See supplementary records, clerk's office, 3rd floor, Northwest cabinet. She looked up, her eyes bright. There are more documents. Hidden somewhere else in the building. The group exchanged glances, energy suddenly renewed despite their exhaustion. Third floor, Linda said. Let's go. The courthouse had 3 levels, not counting the basement. The main floor held the courtroom and administrative offices. The second floor had judges' chambers and meeting rooms. The third floor, they discovered as they climbed the creaking stairs, Marcus leading the way with his flashlight, had housed the clerk's office and record storage. The space was vast and dusty, filled with filing cabinets and boxes that mice had turned into nesting material. But in the northwest corner, they found what they were looking for, a large wooden cabinet, locked with a padlock that looked newer than everything else in the room. Someone's been here recently, David observed, examining the lock. This isn't 70 years old. Can we open it? Sarah asked. Marcus pulled out a multi-tool from one of his many pockets. Give me 5 minutes. It took 7, but the lock finally clicked open, and Marcus pulled the cabinet doors wide. Inside were boxes, dozens of them, all labeled with dates and codes. Sarah pulled out the nearest one, her hands shaking with anticipation and dread. Inside were more files, more photographs, more records. But these were different. These were follow-up reports, tracking what happened to the children after they were placed. Medical records, death certificates, and worst of all, photographs documenting the effects of the experiments performed on them. Keisha made a choking sound and turned away, her hand over her mouth. Even Linda, who'd seen war zones and crime scenes, looked pale. The images were graphic, clinical in their horror. Children with surgical scars, with visible deformities from experimental treatments, with eyes that held no light, no hope, no humanity left in them. Oh God, Sarah whispered. Oh God, what did they do? Dr. Monroe was reading through one of the medical files, her expression grim. Experimental tuberculosis treatments. Psychiatric drugs that hadn't been approved for human trials. Surgical procedures meant to correct behavioral abnormalities. This wasn't just exploitation. This was systematic torture disguised as medical research. And it continued until 1956, David said, reading from another file. 6 years after the Nuremberg Code established ethical standards for human experimentation. They knew it was wrong. They knew it was illegal. And they did it anyway. Sarah sank down to the floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just a local scandal. This was a crime against humanity, a systematic violation of human rights that had continued for decades with the full knowledge and participation of respected community leaders, medical professionals, and government officials. We need to call the FBI, Linda said flatly. Maybe the DOJ. This is beyond anything we can handle on our own. And say what? Marcus challenged. That we broke into an abandoned building and found evidence of crimes committed 70 years ago? They'll take the documents and bury them in a warehouse somewhere, and nothing will change. He's right, Sarah said, her voice hollow. Federal agencies don't care about historical crimes unless there's political pressure to care. We need to make this public first, create a groundswell of attention that forces official action. That's dangerous, Linda warned. If we go public before securing these documents properly, before getting legal protection, we're painting targets on our backs. We already have targets on our backs, Keisha said quietly. The moment we walked into this building, the moment we found that first box, we became a threat to people who've spent their entire lives protecting these secrets. As if to underscore her point, they heard a sound from downstairs. Not footsteps this time, but something else. Glass breaking. Then voices, multiple voices, raised in anger. Everybody stay quiet, Marcus whispered, switching off his flashlight. The others did the same, plunging the third floor into darkness broken only by the moonlight filtering through dirty windows. The voices grew louder, moving through the first floor. Sarah could make out words now. Can't let them take it public. Destroy everything we've built. Just scare them, make them understand. Her heart hammered so loudly, she was sure everyone could hear it. Beside her, she felt Linda's hand find hers, squeezing tight. This was what Dr. Monroe had warned them about. This was the backlash, arriving faster than any of them had anticipated. Marcus pulled out his phone. The screen glowed shockingly bright in the darkness. He was recording, Sarah realized, documenting whatever was about to happen. Smart. If things went wrong, at least there would be evidence. The voices reached the second floor now, footsteps heavy on the stairs.
"They're up here somewhere," someone said.
Caldwell said there were 6 of them. Caldwell. The mayor had warned them after all, or these people had connections that had alerted them even faster. Either way, they were trapped. The only staircase led down, right into whoever was looking for them. Unless… Sarah's mind raced, thinking about the courthouse's layout. Old buildings like this often had fire escapes, service stairs, alternative exits designed for emergency evacuations. She leaned close to Marcus, whispering directly into his ear. Fire escapes. Back of the building. He nodded, understanding immediately. He gestured to the others, pointing toward the rear of the 3rd floor. They moved as silently as possible, Sarah clutching one of the boxes of documents, refusing to leave without evidence even if it meant risking their safety. They found it, a narrow door painted the same color as the walls, nearly invisible in the darkness. Marcus tried the handle. Locked, but with the same style of old mechanism as the cabinet had been. He worked quickly, fingers sure despite the pressure, while the footsteps below drew closer, now on the 2nd floor landing. The lock clicked. The door swung open, revealing a metal fire escape that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Sarah sent up a silent prayer that it would hold their weight. "Go," Marcus whispered urgently. Quick and quiet. Dr. Monroe went first, moving with surprising agility for a woman her age. Then Keisha, then David, each testing the metal grating before committing their full weight. Linda pulled Sarah close, whispering fiercely, "If anything happens, you run. You get these documents somewhere safe, and you tell this story. Promise me." "Nothing's going to happen," Sarah whispered back, but she was lying and they both knew it. Linda went next, and then it was Sarah's turn. She stepped out onto the fire escape, the metal cold and slightly rusted under her hands, the box of documents clutched against her chest. Below, she could see the others descending, Marcus bringing up the rear, still filming, still documenting. Behind them, from inside the building, Sarah heard the door to the 3rd floor burst open, heard voices shouting as they discovered the group's escape route. "They're going down the fire escape. Cut them off." The chase was on. Sarah scrambled down the metal stairs, her feet slipping on rust and bird droppings, her breath coming in panicked gasps. 2 floors down, 1 floor, and then her feet hit solid ground in the alley behind the courthouse. "Run!" Marcus shouted, no longer any need for stealth. They ran, scattering like startled birds. Sarah followed Linda, who seemed to know instinctively where to go, cutting through backyards and side streets, putting distance between them and their pursuers. Behind them, Sarah could hear shouting, and could hear what sounded like more people joining the chase. They ended up, breathless and terrified, behind the Millbrook Library, hiding in the shadow of an industrial dumpster while footsteps pounded past on the main street. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. But she still had the box, still had the evidence. Slowly, cautiously, they emerged from hiding. The street was empty now, the pursuers having passed by. In the distance, Sarah could hear sirens, whether coming to help them or stop them. She couldn't tell. Her phone buzzed. Messages flooding in from Marcus, from Dr. Monroe, from David and Keisha. Everyone had escaped separately, everyone was safe, everyone still had portions of the documents they'd recovered. "We need to get out of Millbrook," Linda said, her voice shaking with an emotion Sarah had never heard from her aunt before.
Fear.
Real, genuine fear. "We need to get somewhere safe, somewhere public, and we need to release this story before they can stop us." Sarah looked at the box in her arms, at the weight of history and horror it contained. She thought about the children in the photographs, about their suffering, about how close their stories had come to being lost forever. And she thought about the people who'd just chased them through the dark, who were so desperate to keep these secrets buried that they'd resort to violence. "No," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. We don't run. We go back to the inn, we compile everything we have, and tomorrow morning, we hold a press conference. Right here in Millbrook, right in front of the courthouse. We make this public in a way they can't suppress or deny. We tell the truth, and we do it in a way that forces the world to listen. Linda stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw the exact moment her aunt's fear transformed into pride. "You're your grandmother's girl," Linda said softly. "Brave and stubborn and unwilling to back down even when you should." She pulled out her phone. "Okay, let's do this. But we do it smart. I've got contacts at the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Associated Press. By morning, we'll have so many reporters here that our new friends won't be able to touch us without the whole world watching." They made their way back to the inn, taking a circuitous route, staying in shadows, moving like fugitives, which Sarah realized is exactly what they were. Fugitives from a truth that people would kill to suppress, refugees from a past that refused to stay buried. Mrs. Vance met them at the door, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Hendricks called," she said without preamble. "He said to tell you that you stirred up a hornet's nest, and that some of those hornets have very long stingers. He said." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "He said to be careful who you trust, because some of the oldest families in Millbrook have the most to lose." "Did he say anything else?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Vance nodded slowly. "He said that his father kept journals. Personal records of everything that happened during his years on the police force. And that if you want them, they're in a storage unit out on Route 9. Unit 47. The key is taped under the mailbox at his house." They didn't sleep that night either.
How could they?
The inn's small dining room had been transformed into a war room, every surface covered with documents, laptops glowing in the darkness, phones charging in a tangle of cables that looked like technological spaghetti. Marcus had set up his editing station in one corner, compiling footage into a preliminary video that would serve as visual evidence for the press conference. Dr. Monroe and Keisha were cross-referencing victim names with genealogical databases, building family trees, and identifying living descendants who deserved to know the truth. David was on his laptop, drafting legal documents that would protect them from lawsuits while maximizing their ability to share the evidence. And Linda was working her contacts, calling in favors from 30 years in the journalism business, ensuring that by morning, Millbrook would be swarming with reporters from every major news outlet on the East Coast. Sarah had slipped out just after midnight, alone despite Linda's protests, to retrieve the key from Mr. Hendricks's mailbox. His house was dark, but as Sarah bent down to feel under the metal box, she saw a curtain twitch in an upstairs window. He was watching and waiting, and finally, after all these years of silence, choosing to speak through her. The key was there, exactly where he'd said it would be, wrapped in a piece of paper with an address written in shaky handwriting, Storage USA, Route 9, Unit 47. And beneath that, 3 words that made Sarah's throat tighten. "Thank you." Finally, the storage facility was deserted at this hour, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. Sarah had insisted on going alone, had felt that somehow this was something she needed to do herself, a private communion with history. The unit was small, maybe 6 by 8 feet, and when she rolled up the metal door, she found it nearly empty. Just 3 boxes, carefully labeled in the same shaky handwriting. Police records 1943 to 1958. Personal journals 1940 to 1959. Evidence. Sarah loaded them into her car with reverent care, feeling the weight of them not just physically, but metaphysically. These were Mr. Hendricks's father's legacy, his attempt at redemption for crimes committed through silence and complicity. This was his way of saying, "I knew, and I did nothing, and I'm sorry, and here is my penance." Sarah understood that impulse bone deep, carried her own guilt the same way, knew what it meant to try to atone for the past by serving the truth in the present. Back at the inn, she set the boxes on the dining room table, and the group gathered around like worshippers at an altar. Linda opened the first box with careful hands, pulling out leather-bound journals that smelled of old paper and older secrets. She opened one at random and began to read aloud. October 12, 1947. Whitmore called me to his chambers today. Another family, the Kowalskis, Polish immigrants, 3 children. He's fabricated charges, neglect, moral turpitude, the usual lies. Told me to process the paperwork, have the children removed by week's weekend. I tried to argue, tried to say the family seemed decent enough, but he shut me down. Reminded me that I have a pension to think about, a family to feed. Reminds me what happens to policemen who don't follow orders. Linda's voice cracked slightly. The children were taken on Friday. The youngest was 4 years old. I watched Mrs. Kowalski scream as they were loaded into the van. I'll hear that sound for the rest of my life. The room was silent except for the hum of computers and Marcus's quiet breathing. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. This was it. This was the human face of complicity, the slow erosion of morality through fear and self-interest, and the 1,000 small compromises people make to survive in corrupt systems. They read through the night, taking turns, voices hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. The journals were detailed, meticulous, a complete record of every child taken, every family destroyed, every payoff made, every threat delivered. Officer Hendricks had documented it all, had created a secret archive of guilt that he'd carried like a cross until his death. And now, 70 years later, that archive would finally serve its purpose. The evidence box was worse. It contained things Officer Hendricks had secretly collected, stolen from crime scenes and evidence lockers and Judge Whitmore's own office. Photographs too disturbing to have been included in official files. Medical reports documenting injuries inconsistent with the labor accidents they'd been reported as. Letters from parents begging for the return of their children, letters that had been intercepted and never delivered. And most damning of all, financial records showing exactly how much money had changed hands, who had received it, and which prominent Millbrook families had built their fortunes on the systematic exploitation of stolen children. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given the darkness they'd been swimming through, Dr. Monroe made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been going through the roster of victims, cross-referencing with census data and birth records, when she went very still, her face draining of color. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I need you to look at this." Sarah crossed to where Dr. Monroe sat, her laptop screen glowing in the early morning light. On it was a family tree, branches spreading across decades, connecting past to present. Dr. Monroe pointed to one branch, to a name that made Sarah's heart stop. Sophia Kowalski, age 4, taken into custody November 1947. Placed at Braxton State Hospital. Dr. Monroe's finger moved down the tree.
She survived.
She was released in 1962, age 19, after 15 years of institutionalization. Changed her name to Sophie Vance. Married Robert Vance in 1965. Dr. Monroe looked up, her eyes meeting Sarah's. Eleanor Vance, the woman who owns this inn, is Sophia Kowalski's daughter-in-law. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah thought about Mrs. Vance, about her kindness, her cheerful hospitality, her easy conversation about Millbrook's history. Had she known? Had she understood what her mother-in-law had endured? Or had that story, like so many others, been buried beneath years of trauma and shame? "There's more," Dr. Monroe said softly. "Thomas Hendricks, the retired teacher you met yesterday. His mother was Clara Nowak, age 7, taken in 1945, placed at Riverside Industrial School. She survived too. Married James Hendricks in 1958. Sarah sat down heavily, her mind reeling. The victims weren't just names in dusty files. They were living history, roots of family trees that still grew in Millbrook soil. The trauma wasn't abstract or distant. It was carried in the DNA of people still living, still breathing, still trying to make sense of losses they'd never fully understood. "How many?" Sarah asked. "How many of the victims survived, had children, have living descendants?" Dr. Monroe pulled up a spreadsheet, numbers and names organizing chaos into comprehensible data. Of the 73 children documented in Whitmore's records, we've confirmed that 18 survived to adulthood. They had a combined 32 children, who in turn had 67 grandchildren. Many of them still live in the area. Some still live in Millbrook.
Jesus, Marcus breathed.
The entire town is built on this trauma. It's not just history, it's living memory, passed down through generations even if people don't consciously know what they're remembering. Which means, Linda said slowly, working through the implications, that when we release this story, we're not just exposing the past. We're giving these families context for their present, for the nightmares they've had, the fears they couldn't explain, the sense that something was wrong in their family history that they could never quite put their finger on. Sarah thought about Mr. Hendricks, about the regret in his eyes when he'd talked about his father. He'd known something, had felt the shadow of his mother's trauma, even if he hadn't understood its source. How many others in Millbrook carried that same shadow, that same inherited pain? We need to tell them first, Sarah said suddenly. Before the press conference. We need to contact the survivors and their families, give them the chance to learn the truth privately before it becomes public spectacle. They deserve that. That's a kind impulse, David said carefully. But it's also risky. If we approach people directly, word will spread. Someone will try to stop us before we can hold the press conference. I don't care, Sarah said firmly. We're not doing this just to expose crimes. We're doing it to give families closure, to honor the victims, to speak truth that's been silenced for too long. And that means treating the survivors and their descendants with respect, not as subjects in a story, but as human beings with the right to process this information on their own terms. Linda was nodding slowly. She's right. And practically speaking, if we approach the families first, some of them might be willing to speak at the press conference. Personal testimony will make this real in a way that documents alone can't. It'll be harder to dismiss as ancient history if people are standing there saying this happened to my mother, to my grandmother, to me. They divided up the list. Dr. Monroe and Keisha would contact the survivors themselves, the handful still living in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, frail bodies carrying memories too heavy for flesh to bear. David and Marcus would reach out to the children of victims, people now in their 60s and 70s who'd grown up with parents who couldn't speak about the past but couldn't escape it either. Sarah and Linda would handle the more delicate cases, people like Eleanor Vance and Thomas Hendricks, people who lived in Millbrook and had reputations to protect, people who might not want their family's trauma exposed to the world. Sarah approached Mrs. Vance first, catching her alone in the inn's kitchen as she prepared breakfast for guests who hadn't yet come down. The older woman looked up with her usual warm smile, but Sarah saw the way it faltered when she registered Sarah's expression. Mrs. Vance, Sarah said gently, I need to talk to you about something difficult. About your mother-in-law, Sophia. The color drained from Eleanor Vance's face. Her hands, which had been busy with eggs and a whisk, went still. How do you know that name? She whispered. Nobody calls her that. She's been Sophie for 60 years. She buried Sophia in that hospital. Can we sit? Sarah asked, gesturing to the small table in the corner of the kitchen. Mrs. Vance nodded mutely, sinking into a chair like a puppet with cut strings. Sarah sat across from her and, as gently as she could, explained what they'd found. The documents. The photographs. The systematic trafficking of children that had stolen Sophia Kowalski away from her family when she was 4 years old. Mrs. Vance listened with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. When Sarah finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the tick of the kitchen clock and the distant sound of guests stirring upstairs. She never talked about it, Mrs. Vance finally said. Sophie. My mother-in-law. She was the sweetest woman, so gentle, so kind. But there was something broken in her, something we could all feel but never understood. She'd have nightmares, terrible screaming fits in the middle of the night. She couldn't bear to be touched unexpectedly. You had to warn her first, let her see you coming. And she hoarded food, kept cans and boxes hidden all over the house like she was afraid of starving. Fresh tears spilled over. Robert, my husband, he used to ask her about her childhood, where she grew up, about her parents. She'd just shake her head and say it was too long ago to remember. But you could see in her eyes that she remembered everything, that she remembered too much. Is she still alive? Sarah asked gently. Mrs. Vance shook her head. She passed away 5 years ago. Alzheimer's took her in the end, which was maybe a mercy, because it took the memories too. Toward the end, she'd talk about her mother, about her sisters, about the house they lived in before. But she'd talk about them in present tense, like she was 4 years old again, and they'd just stepped out of the room. She looked up at Sarah with red-rimmed eyes.
What happened to them?
Her family? Sarah had anticipated this question and had asked Dr. Monroe to research it. Her parents were Stefan and Maria Kowalski. They immigrated from Poland in 1938. After Sophia was taken, they had 2 more daughters. They searched for Sophia for years, filed missing person reports, hired a private investigator they couldn't afford. But Judge Whitmore's records showed she'd been placed in foster care out of state, and there was no trail to follow. Her parents died in a car accident in 1956. Her sisters, your husband's aunts, are still alive. One lives in Boston, one in Hartford. Mrs. Vance pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They never found her, and she never knew they'd kept looking. She lowered her hands, her expression transforming from grief to something harder, sharper. You're going to tell the story. You're going to make sure everyone knows what was done to these children. Yes, Sarah said simply. If you'll let me include Sophie's story. If you think she would have wanted people to know. Mrs. Vance stood, moving to the window that looked out over Main Street, over the courthouse visible in the distance. Sophie spent her whole life being ashamed of where she came from, of the years in that hospital, of the things that were done to her there that she could never bring herself to name. She thought she was damaged, broken, unworthy of the good life she'd managed to build with Robert and their children. She turned back to Sarah, her eyes blazing with something that might have been anger or might have been hope. She was wrong. She wasn't damaged. She was wounded, and there's a difference. She survived horrors that would have destroyed most people, and she still managed to be kind, to be loving, to give her family everything she'd never had. That's not broken. That's heroic. Then I'll tell her story, Sarah promised. I'll tell it in a way that honors her strength, not just her suffering. And I'll make sure her parents' names are included, so the world knows they never stopped loving her, never stopped searching. Mrs. Vance nodded, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. I'll speak at your press conference. I'll tell them about Sophie, about what this town stole from her, and what she managed to hold on to anyway. The conversation with Thomas Hendricks was different, quieter, weighted with different kinds of guilt. Sarah and Linda found him in his small house on Oak Street, a neat craftsman bungalow with a tidy garden and a flagpole in the front yard. He opened the door like he'd been expecting them, ushered them into a living room that smelled like coffee and old books. You found my father's records, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Sarah confirmed. Thank you for trusting us with them. Hendricks lowered himself into an armchair that had clearly been his for decades, molded to the shape of his body. I've known about them since I was 18. Found them in the attic after my father died. He'd left a letter, explaining everything. What he'd done, what he'd failed to do, what he wanted me to do with the evidence. He smiled without humor. Took me 57 years to find the courage to actually do it. Why now? Linda asked gently. Because I'm dying, Hendricks said bluntly. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And I realized I didn't want to die carrying my father's guilt, my own guilt. I wanted to die knowing I'd finally done the right thing, even if it was decades too late. He looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much and understood more. Your press conference is at 10?
Yes.
In front of the courthouse. I'll be there. I'll tell them about my mother, about Clara Nowak, who became Clara Hendricks, who spent her whole life flinching from loud noises and crying in her sleep. I'll tell them about my father, who couldn't stop what was happening but at least had the decency to document it. And I'll tell them that silence is its own kind of violence, and that every day we don't speak the truth is another day we choose complicity over courage. By 9:30, they had assembled in the inn's parking lot. Mrs. Vance, freshly composed, in a dark dress that looked like it might have been her funeral clothes. Mr. Hendricks, leaning on a cane, his face gray with pain but his eyes bright with purpose. And 3 others, Michael Reese, whose father had been taken at age 6 and spent 8 years at Riverside Industrial School. Patricia Santos, whose grandmother had been one of the children sold to the tuberculosis sanitarium and had survived against impossible odds. And Jennifer Kowalski Brown, who'd grown up in Hartford not knowing she had an aunt who'd been stolen decades before her birth, who'd driven through the night when Dr. Monroe called and explained the connection. The reporters were already gathering when they arrived at the courthouse. Linda's calls had worked. Sarah counted crews from CNN, MSNBC, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Associated Press, and at least a dozen local outlets. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward, cameras being tested and adjusted. The story was already leaking, Sarah could tell. Reporters were talking urgently into phones, typing on laptops, that particular electricity in the air that came when journalists sensed they were onto something big. And standing at the edge of the crowd, watching with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read, was Mayor Caldwell. He saw her looking and raised a hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been surrender. Beside him were others, older residents, prominent family names Sarah recognized from her research. Some looked angry. Some looked afraid. Some, like Caldwell, just looked resigned. Marcus had set up a podium, borrowed from the library, with a microphone connected to a portable PA system. Behind it, on display boards, were enlarged photographs, not the most disturbing ones, but powerful nonetheless. Children's faces. Documents with Judge Whitmore's signature. The courthouse itself, that beautiful, terrible monument to injustice. At precisely 10 o'clock, Sarah stepped up to the podium. Her hands were shaking, her mouth dry, but her voice when she spoke was steady, amplified by the microphone, carrying across the crowd of reporters and residents who'd gathered to hear what would happen, what would finally be said. "My name is Sarah Chen," she began. "I'm an investigative journalist and documentarian. 3 days ago, I entered the abandoned courthouse behind me, looking for history. What I found was horror. For 33 years, from 1923 to 1956, Judge Thomas Whitmore used his position to traffic children. He stole them from families he deemed unfit, code for poor, immigrant, politically inconvenient, and sold them to local businesses as unpaid labor. 73 children that we know of. 73 families destroyed. 73 lives stolen, some ended, some damaged beyond repair." She paused, letting the words sink in, watching the reporters' expressions shift from professional interest to genuine shock. But this wasn't one man's crime. It was systematic. It involved police officers, social workers, factory owners, medical professionals, government officials. It required the complicity of an entire community, either through active participation or through willful ignorance. And for 70 years, it's been covered up, buried, erased from official history. Sarah gestured to the people standing behind her. "Today, we're here to say, no more silence. No more erasure. These are the descendants of victims, and they're here to tell you what this town tried to hide. What America tried to hide. Because, make no mistake, what happened in Millbrook happened in towns across this country. Children as commodities. Vulnerable populations as resources to be exploited. And systems of power protecting themselves at any cost." She stepped back, and Mrs. Vance came forward. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke, telling Sophie's story, describing the nightmares and the hoarded food and the love that survived trauma. Mr. Hendricks followed, his voice a teacher's voice even now, clear and authoritative, explaining his mother's suffering and his father's guilt and his own decades of cowardice finally overcome. One by one, the descendants spoke, giving voice to silences that had lasted 3 generations. The reporters were rapt, cameras rolling, pens flying across notebooks. Sarah saw several with tears in their eyes, saw the way this story was landing with them, the way truth told with such raw emotion couldn't be dismissed or explained away. When the testimonies ended, Sarah returned to the podium. "We have documents, photographs, ledgers, personal journals, medical records. We have evidence that is overwhelming, irrefutable, and horrifying. We're making all of it available to researchers, historians, law enforcement, and most importantly, to the families of victims who deserve to know what happened to their relatives. Judge Whitmore's crimes, and the complicity that enabled them, are no longer secret. As of this moment, they're part of the historical record. And Millbrook, Massachusetts, along with every other community that participated in or benefited from the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children, is going to have to face that truth. The questions came in a rush, reporters shouting over each other. Sarah answered what she could, deferred to Dr. Monroe for historical context, to David for legal implications, to the descendants for personal impact. The press conference stretched from 30 minutes to an hour, then 90 minutes, the story too big, too complex, too important to be contained in sound bites. Finally, as the crowd began to thin, a reporter from the Boston Globe asked the question Sarah had been waiting for. "Miss Chen, what do you want to come from this? What's your end goal?" Sarah looked at the courthouse, at the building that had held these secrets for so long, at the judge's bench visible through the dirty windows where terrible decisions had been made day after day, year after year. She thought about Claire, about Papa, about all the stories that had been silenced. And she thought about the children in the photographs, about their faces that would now be seen, their names that would now be spoken, their suffering that would now be acknowledged.
"Justice," she said simply.
Whatever that can mean 70 years after the crimes were committed. Compensation for survivors and their families, if that's possible. A criminal prosecution if any perpetrators are still alive, though I doubt any are. But more than that, recognition. Acknowledgement. A collective reckoning with what was done here, what was allowed to happen here, because until we face the worst parts of our history, we're doomed to repeat these patterns. She paused, feeling the weight of every eye on her. So yes, I want justice. But I also want truth. Full, uncomfortable, undeniable truth. Because that's the only foundation on which real healing can be built. The press conference ended with a bombshell. Mayor Caldwell stepped forward, asked for the microphone, and in a voice thick with emotion, announced that he was calling for a full independent investigation into Millbrook's historical records, that he was establishing a victim compensation fund using town resources, and that he was formally apologizing, on behalf of the municipality, for the crimes committed under the authority of the town's government. "We can't undo the past," he said, and Sarah saw tears on his face, saw the genuine anguish of a man who'd spent his life trying to make his community good only to learn it was built on atrocity. "We can't bring back the stolen years, can't heal the inflicted wounds, can't restore the destroyed families. But we can acknowledge what happened. We can honor the victims. We can face our history honestly, instead of hiding from it. And we can commit to being better, to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again, that vulnerable members of our community are protected rather than exploited." It was a remarkable moment, and Sarah knew even as it happened that it would be the headline, the pull quote, the soundbite that defined the story. The mayor confronts the town's dark past. The community leader apologizes for historical crimes. It was what journalism called a good news angle, a way to frame tragedy with hope, to suggest that confession and contrition could lead to redemption. But Sarah also knew it wasn't enough. Apologies didn't resurrect the dead, didn't heal trauma, didn't undo decades of suffering. Still, it was something. It was acknowledgement, which was more than these victims had gotten in 70 years. It was a start. As the crowd dispersed, as reporters rushed to file their stories and residents drifted back to their lives forever changed by what they'd learned, Sarah found herself alone at the courthouse steps. Alone except for Marcus, who appeared beside her with his quiet solidarity, and Linda, who put an arm around her niece's shoulders. "You did it," Linda said softly. "You gave them voice. You told the story that needed telling." Sarah nodded, feeling hollowed out, exhausted beyond words, but also somehow lighter. The weight she'd been carrying since finding that first box, the responsibility of bearing witness to such profound suffering, she'd shared it now. It wasn't just hers anymore. The world knew. The victims were remembered. The truth was spoken. Papa would be proud, Linda added. She understood what it cost to speak the truth. She understood what it cost to stay silent. And I think, if she could see you now, she'd know that her sacrifice, her silence, wasn't for nothing. Because you're the antidote to silence. You're the one who speaks when others can't or won't. Sarah leaned into her aunt's embrace, letting herself be held, letting herself feel the enormity of what they'd accomplished. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of the courthouse, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, but peace. The peace that came from knowing she'd honored her promise, to Claire, to herself, to every forgotten voice that had cried out in the darkness. The story was told. The truth was known. And whatever happened next, that couldn't be taken away. Sarah's investigation into Millbrook's child trafficking system exploded into national consciousness within hours of the press conference. Major media outlets, CNN, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, covered the story extensively, with the Globe eventually winning a Pulitzer Prize for their 3-month investigation. Sarah's YouTube video documenting the case reached 8 million views in the first week, 20 million by month's end, sparking responses from people worldwide who finally understood their own families' buried traumas. The response was overwhelming, but not universally positive. Within 48 hours, Sarah faced death threats, online harassment campaigns questioning her credibility and mental stability, and coordinated attempts to discredit her work. Old Millbrook families prepared defamation suits, claiming she'd damaged reputations and destroyed the town's economy. The legal threats were manageable, truth provided absolute defense, but the deeper resistance came from residents whose foundational myths about their community had been shattered. Mrs. Vance experienced social ostracism for breaking silence, receiving cold shoulders, and losing friendships. Yet she refused to apologize, honoring Sophie's memory by choosing courage over comfort. Mr. Hendricks, dying and at peace, faced accusations of betrayal from old guard families, but found solace in finally doing something meaningful, in making his mother's invisible suffering visible. As weeks turned to months, the story's scope expanded dramatically. Researchers nationwide descended on Millbrook, revealing systematic child exploitation stretching far beyond one Massachusetts town. A national pattern embedded in still existing institutions, enabled by laws still on the books, rooted in unexamined attitudes about poverty, race, and worthiness. Dr. Monroe was approached to write a definitive history of 20th-century child labor trafficking, inviting Sarah to co-author. Meanwhile, David and Keisha filed suits against institutions that had directly benefited from Judge Whitmore's trafficking, seeking not just compensation but official acknowledgement, formal apologies, and policy changes. The first settlement came 6 weeks after the press conference. Riverside Manufacturing agreed to pay $8 million into a victim compensation fund and establish a museum and memorial. This victory, though modest monetarily, was symbolically enormous. Establishing precedent and proving accountability was possible across decades. The backlash intensified after the settlement. Sarah's Queens apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen but belongings ransacked, computer destroyed, threatening messages spray-painted. She moved in with Marcus temporarily, but refused her Aunt Linda's suggestion to stop, committed to identifying all victims by name so they wouldn't be erased again. A pivotal moment arrived 2 months post-conference, a letter from Margaret Whitmore Carlyle, Judge Whitmore's granddaughter, offering his personal diaries, 23 years documenting his crimes with chilling banality. Margaret, 83, and unwilling to die carrying poisonous secrets like her grandmother, chose truth over family reputation. The diaries were devastating, confirming everything and revealing more. Bribes to state officials, names of complicit judges and politicians, Whitmore's full awareness of his wrongdoing and confidence that his social standing would protect him. His words, "The system protects men like me, who will believe them over me," became the most quoted passage, used in discussions of power, privilege, and institutional corruption. Margaret's public testimony, reading excerpts at a press conference, made international news. Her courage in confronting family legacy inspired other connected families to come forward with apologies and additional evidence, creating a culture where facing difficult truths became strength rather than weakness. Millbrook itself transformed. The town council renamed the community center the Sofia Kowalski Memorial Center for Community Justice, established a permanent exhibition documenting the trafficking system, and rewrote official history to incorporate previously ignored dark chapters. Not universally supported, some residents moved away, businesses closed, but the town developed moral clarity from facing truth rather than fleeing it. The work took its toll on Sarah. Weight loss, poor sleep, nightmares, panic attacks in enclosed spaces. 5 months after the press conference, Marcus convinced her to rest, reminding her that others could carry the burden temporarily. She spent a month at her parents' San Francisco home, her father, recovering well from his heart attack, advising that burning out didn't honor those she tried to help, just created more casualties. Her mother revealed that Linda had told her Papa's real wartime story, wishing Papa had felt safe enough to share it herself. They discussed how secrets start as protection but end as prison, 3 generations learning to transform isolation into connection, silence into story, shame into understanding. Returning to New York rested if not healed, Sarah found her role had shifted from lone investigator to part of a movement. The book with Dr. Monroe progressed toward definitive documentation. Legal cases proceeded steadily. Survivors formed healing communities. Sarah created a YouTube series called After the Silence, exploring not discovery but aftermath, healing, and lessons learned. 6 months post-conference, Sarah received an email from Amanda Walsh, a former NYU classmate who'd used Sarah's methods to investigate an Ohio reform school, uncovering similar abuse patterns. Amanda credited Sarah's compassionate, victim-centered approach with showing her this journalism was possible. Sarah immediately offered support, introducing Amanda to her network, watching as another investigation flourished. This was the real legacy, not just specific truths uncovered, but the template provided for approaching difficult stories with integrity, inspiring cascading truth-telling that would outlive her. Change happened not through single heroic acts, but through persistent, patient, collective effort, people choosing courage over comfort, truth over convenience, compassion over cruelty. Section 6, Epilogue. 3 years later, Sarah stood before the transformed Millbrook Courthouse, now the National Center for Historical Justice, a restored museum and research facility. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds, survivors, descendants wearing buttons with lost relatives' photographs, journalists, researchers, advocates, politicians, and moved citizens. Mrs. Vance sat front row with Jennifer Kowalski Brown, Sophie's niece. Mr. Hendricks had died 18 months prior, but his daughter attended carrying his photograph. Margaret Carlyle sat farther back, still grappling with her place in this healing ceremony. A children's choir opened with hymns about freedom and remembrance, children honoring stolen children, a cosmic balancing. Mayor Caldwell acknowledged his family's complicity, his own willful ignorance, having stayed in office and won re-election through commitment to facing difficult history. He'd become a national figure on historical reconciliation. Dr. Monroe, in academic regalia with doctoral students, spoke about history as conversation between past and present. Their co-authored book, Stolen Children, Systematic Trafficking and Exploitation in 20th Century America, had won the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize for History, translated into 12 languages, becoming the definitive text ensuring these crimes would never be forgotten or dismissed. Sarah's speech acknowledged the discovery's weight of responsibility, the fear and backlash, why she didn't quit, the faces in photographs, Mrs. Vance's stories, Mr. Hendricks's descriptions of his mother's decades-long trauma. She spoke of injustice's long half-life, rippling through generations until someone says enough. She thanked survivors for their courage in speaking truth despite costs, for teaching what healing looks like, for inspiring thousands worldwide to tell their own stories. Mrs. Vance embraced her afterward, whispering gratitude for making sure victims weren't forgotten. The museum tour revealed careful, unflinching documentation, first gallery honoring 73 victims individually, second detailing the system's operation, third presenting disturbing medical records behind curtained areas with warnings, giving visitors choice while preserving complete historical record, fourth documenting aftermath, settlements, apologies, healing journeys, Fifth, interactive and forward-looking, connecting historical patterns to contemporary exploitation, providing action items and advocacy resources. Sarah found Marcus in the final gallery, standing before visitor comments filled with heartfelt responses, people wrestling with implications, writing about missing relatives and family mysteries suddenly understood, committing to preventing future abuse. Marcus reminded her she'd changed the world. She insisted it was a team effort. Margaret Carlyle, standing alone by a window, expressed difficulty being in the place where her grandfather committed atrocities, grappling with having benefited from blood money. She'd established the Whitmore Family Justice Fund, redirecting all inherited wealth towards supporting abuse survivors, funding justice research, helping communities investigate histories, transforming exploitation resources toward healing and prevention. Next morning, Sarah walked Millbrook's changed streets, new businesses drawn by museum traffic, revised school curricula, normalized community conversations about justice and accountability. The town had become a model for confronting dark histories by integration rather than erasure. Texts arrived, Linda praising the ceremony, saying Papa would be proud, her parents expressing gratitude and requesting visits, Marcus inviting coffee. Meeting him, they discussed next steps. Sarah wanted to continue finding forgotten spaces and telling buried stories, but with a team, building something structured and sustainable. They established the Forgotten Voices Project, a nonprofit investigating historical injustices and supporting communities through reckoning with difficult truths. Dr. Monroe, David, Keisha, and Linda joined. They hired specialized researchers, created ethical protocols, developed partnerships with universities and organizations. Their first investigation beyond Millbrook examined an Alabama reform school using predominantly Black children as unpaid cotton field labor and medical experiment subjects. The second investigated Southwest Catholic orphanages where Indigenous children were forcibly enrolled, culturally stripped, and abused, leading to Vatican apologies, settlements, and policy changes. 5 years post-Millbrook, Sarah received a MacArthur Fellowship, $800,000 over 5 years, validating her work's societal contribution. The money funded Forgotten Voices expansion. The recognition affirmed her life choice. A podcast interview asked about personal costs. Sarah answered honestly. It costs peace of mind, ability to see the world optimistically, relationships, and faith in humanity. But she gains purpose, connection with survivors, satisfaction watching justice happen, knowing acknowledgement and truth matter. Asked if she'd do it again knowing the costs, she didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely, because the alternative is complicity. The episode went viral, thanked by journalists for acknowledging the toll, by survivors for understanding truth-telling's price, by young people for honest guidance about this career path. 7 years after Millbrook, sitting in her parents' San Francisco garden where she'd once recovered, Sarah discussed Papa with her father. He reflected that Papa did what she thought necessary to survive but paid with pieces of herself she couldn't reclaim, suggesting regret was too simple for that complicated grief. Sarah nodded, understanding. I think about her when I'm deciding whether to take on a new investigation, when I'm weighing the cost against the potential good. And I always come back to the same conclusion. Silence is its own violence. Choosing not to speak truth when you have the platform and the evidence, that's choosing to let injustice continue. That's choosing comfort over courage, exactly what Papa couldn't do during the war, exactly what I promised Claire I'd never do. But you've learned something Papa never could, her father said gently. You've learned to share the burden, to build community around the work instead of carrying it alone. That's wisdom, Sarah. That's how this becomes sustainable instead of self-destructive. Sarah smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. The Forgotten Voices project now employed 32 people, had completed 7 major investigations, and had trained hundreds of journalists and community advocates in their methods. The work continued, and would always continue, but it no longer rested solely on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed again, a message from one of her researchers about a promising lead on forced sterilization programs in state psychiatric hospitals. Sarah glanced at it, then set the phone aside. Not urgent, her father asked, noting the unusual restraint. "It can wait until tomorrow," Sarah said. "Right now, I'm exactly where I need to be." They sat together as afternoon light softened into evening, 3 generations of Chens learning slowly how to balance justice work with self-care, truth-telling with tenderness, remembering the dead with honoring the living. Papo's secrets had been revealed, her courage finally witnessed. Claire's death had meaning, having catalyzed change that rippled far beyond what either woman could have imagined. And Sarah, no longer the frightened young journalist who'd failed her friend, no longer the isolated investigator carrying impossible burdens alone, had become something she'd never expected, not just a truth-teller, but a teacher. Not just an investigator, but a builder of systems that would outlive her. Not just a survivor of her own trauma, but a guide helping others transform their suffering into strength. The work would never be finished. But that was okay. Some work wasn't meant to be finished. It was meant to be continued, carried forward by each generation, refined and improved and passed on. That was legacy enough. As stars began appearing above the San Francisco fog, Sarah Chen felt, for the first time in 7 years, something approaching peace. Not the absence of pain or the forgetting of injustice, but the deep satisfaction of knowing her life mattered, her choices honored those who'd been silenced, and her work would continue long after she was gone. That was all anyone could ask for. That was everything. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If this investigation moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with others who need to hear it. Stories like this take weeks to research and produce, and your support makes it possible to keep bringing forgotten voices back into the light. What did you think of Sarah's investigation? Let me know in the comments below.